You know that feeling when you look at your paycheck, you see the taxes taken out, and you just kind of wonder, where does all that money actually go? Well, today we're going to follow that money trail and find out exactly who's on the receiving end. I mean, it's one of the biggest, most fundamental questions out there, right? The federal government is moving a mind-blowing amount of money around, and that flow of cash shapes pretty much everything, our economy, our communities, our daily lives, often in ways we don't even realize. And when I say mind-blowing, I mean it. We're talking about over $6 trillion every single year. That is a 6 followed by 12 zeros. It's a number so huge it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. So our goal today, let's try to make that number make a little more sense. All right, let's dive in. Here's our game plan. We'll start with the big picture. Then we're going to break it down piece by piece. Who gets paid directly, how it goes to companies, how it gets to your local town, and finally, we'll look at America's spending around the world. So, how in the world do you start to unpack a number as massive as $6 trillion? Well, the easiest way is to ask a really simple question: who's actually cashing the checks? Now, if you had to guess, you might think of, giant defense contractors or huge corporations. And while they get a piece, you might be really surprised by the answer. The single largest group getting money from the U.S. government is way, way closer to home. In fact, it might even be you or someone you know. And that brings us to our first and, honestly, the most important category. By a long shot, the biggest slice of the pie goes straight into the pockets of individual American citizens. This is the whole ballgame, right here. And check this out. This is a shocker for a lot of people. A full 65%, that's nearly 2/3 of all federal spending, goes directly to individuals. This one category is bigger than everything else put together. So what are we talking about here? Well, these are the programs that make up the country's social safety net. We're talking about Social Security checks for retirees, Medicare and Medicaid for healthcare, benefits for our veterans, and unemployment insurance for folks who've lost their job. Now, the reason this slice of the pie is so huge comes down to this really key budget term: mandatory spending. You see, unlike funding for NASA or national parks that Congress argues about every year, this spending is basically on autopilot. It's required by laws that are already on the books. And this chart just lays it all out there. About 60% of the entire budget is already spoken for because of that mandatory spending. That leaves only about 30% for everything else, the discretionary stuff that Congress actually gets to debate. And that last 10%, well, that's just paying the interest on the national debt. Okay, so after individuals, the next big group on the receiving end is the private sector. The government pays out billions and billions of dollars to companies, from tiny startups to giant corporations, for all the stuff that keeps the country up and running. This happens in basically 3 main ways. First, you've got government contracts, paying for goods and services. Then there are subsidies, which are designed to support entire industries. And finally, there's a whole mix of different loans and grants. So here's the key difference to understand. A contract is super specific. Hey, we'll pay you X amount of money to build this fighter jet. A subsidy, on the other hand, is much broader. It's financial support for a whole industry, like farming, to help make sure we have a stable food supply or to keep prices from going wild. All right, so we've got people and we've got companies. Now let's look at how the federal government pays other governments, specifically how that money trickles down from Washington, D.C. to states and local towns to pay for the services we rely on every day. You can think of this as the way a big national policy turns into something you can actually see in your neighborhood. Congress sets aside money for something like fixing roads. Then federal agencies send that money out to the states, usually as grants. And the states use those funds to do things like, well, pave roads, support local schools, and fund public health clinics. And where does this federal grant money make the biggest dent? Well, healthcare is the giant, mostly to help states pay for Medicaid. But after that, you see huge chunks going to transportation, think highways and bridges, as well as to education and housing assistance. Okay, for our last piece of the puzzle, let's zoom all the way out. Now, it's a much smaller slice of the budget, but it's one that gets a ton of attention. The money the U.S. government sends overseas to support its foreign policy and maintain its presence on the world stage. This international spending isn't just one thing. It comes in a few different flavors. You've got foreign aid, which might be humanitarian help after a disaster, or it could be military aid to an ally.
It also includes the membership dues the U.S. pays to organizations like the UN and NATO. And finally, it's the money that keeps the lights on at every U.S. embassy and consulate around the globe.
So, as you can see, that $6 trillion river of money isn't just flowing in one direction. It's this complex system branching out into every single corner of American life and even beyond, from a grandmother's retirement check to the new pavement on your street to a critical global alliance.
You know, there's this quote from a former Treasury Secretary, Jacob Lew, that I think just nails it. A budget isn't just a spreadsheet with a bunch of numbers. It's a statement. It's a statement about what we as a country think is important. It's a mirror reflecting our collective choices.
Which really leaves us with one last really big question to think about. Knowing what we know now, that the vast, vast majority of spending goes directly to citizens for things like social insurance and healthcare, what does that tell us about the values that are baked into the U.S. budget? Definitely something worth mulling over. Thanks for joining me on this.